Okay, Utkarsha, we can begin.
Okay, thank you, Moonfare. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Product People's weekly community event. I'm Utkarsha. I'm an associate PM with Product People, and today I'll be moderating the session. So I'll just start with the agenda for today. First, I'll briefly introduce Product People and what we do. We'll then move on to the presentation, which will be followed by Q&A session and networking session at the end. So about Product People, we are a product management consultancy and we help companies efficiently discover and deliver great products faster. Through our engagements, we do all the hands-on and unglamorous work of product manager on an interim basis. And most of our contracts are from 3 to 12 months long. We onboard fast, align with teams and deliver outcomes. We are also a product community builder with 6K members, and we invite product leaders to share their knowledge and experience around product management. Here's a quick glance of our current team. And as you can see, Scout, Zalando, Finiata, Tier are some of our clients, among others, with whom we have worked and are currently working with. So we are now hiring for product managers role, and those of you who are interested and are looking for new opportunities, you can apply on productpeople.join.com. So today we are glad to welcome Gerardo, Head of Product at Moonfare, and he'll be sharing with us knowledge around scaling product management from zero to high growth. Thank you, Gerardo, for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Great, thanks for having me. So I guess I share my screen now, 1 second. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So thank you for having me. So today I'll be talking about, or at least the name we gave the chat was scaling product management from scratch. I'll talk first a little bit about myself, just to introduce myself. So a few words about me. My education, my background is in finance and entrepreneurship. Studied entrepreneurship and finance in a small uni in the US called Babson College in Boston. After that, I started my career in an investor role. So I joined JP Morgan after university. Spent a few years there in a group that was working on providing financial products that were currently being provided only to ultra high net worth individuals. And what we were working on was providing those to emerging high net worth, right? So smaller balance sheets. After a few years there, I took a career break, and that's when I moved to Berlin. And through my network, I met one of the founders of Moonfare and joined Moonfare as a third employee at the time before we had any lines of code written. So I saw the companies and launched the company's first MVP. Now, 4 years later, managing a team of around 8 product managers, 7 Scrum teams. So that's a bit about me. And what I'll be going through today is a bit of a recap over the last 4 years, right? Of kind of how I saw different stages of the company and the product change. I'm going to anchor myself to this framework. Perhaps some of you have seen it before. This is quite a common product lifecycle framework, right? Where you start with your innovators, early adopters, early majority, the majority, and then laggards, or otherwise called product death. However, this version of the chart is from a book called Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore. If you haven't read it, it's a great book. Basically talks about or points out that gap between the early adopters and early majority is quite a huge gap, right? Much wider than at any other stage. So he basically adds that as an additional stage. So we'll be going through the first 4 from innovator to early majority. I'll be providing my 2 cents on kind of what I saw at Moonfare, right, from the start. As I built this presentation, there was a lot of sort of best practices that I wanted to point out. However, they turned out to be too many to present. So I actually chose the ones that were less obvious to me at the time. So these are the ones that I'll be pointing out for each stage, kind of like the product success toolkit, right, that is less obvious for that stage. In each of these, I'll also be mentioning who's your user at this point in time, right? Obviously, this is also something the book goes through. And also your expectation of what this stage looks like versus reality, because there's a big mismatch sometimes in that. So let's go to the first stage, yeah, and that is the innovators. Sometimes this is also called market introduction or product introduction, right? It's basically when you first introduce something to the market. This is and a word of warning. A lot of these images I've overly dramatized, so bear with me as I do that. So this is the expectation, I think, of what this looks like, right? When you join a company or startup with 2 or 3 people, you'd kind of expect, in a way, because you've watched too many movies and seen too many TV shows, you kind of expect you're joining the next $1 trillion company, and things should feel exciting and fast and have this kind of like background music to it. But the truth is, it really feels less exciting than this. This is a photo of our first office back in 2017. So these are basically the first tables that we had. There was really nothing else, right? Just kind of like the office and a few tables, and there's a cardboard box in there, right? I think somebody has to mute their mics. Anyway, so it's definitely very different than what you would expect. It's a lot slower. You also have to remember at this point in time, nobody knows what the product is, right? Because everyone gonna have, okay, there's a concept or a vision, but really there's no line of code written. So many things are still in concept stage. You also have to remember at this time, a lot of people don't know each other yet, right? Because we just started working together, but it's a small team. So it's a small team. So it can feel kind of awkward at times. And even though there might not be a lot of people, there might be a lot of people involved in the form of shareholders, advisors, and the likes, there's really not a lot of people involved permanently, right? So it's a very fluid stage. Now, who are your users at this point in time? I've used this image because really it's almost like you have a lemonade stand in front of your house, and your users end up being your friends, your family, your neighbors, obviously in a more professional translation, your network, right? The field experts, depending on the field you're working in. But they really are sort of very, very close allies. So people who will, kind of like help you launch. These users are great because they're your first users, right? So happy days, voila. However, it is very likely they are not representative of your future user base. So you need to be very mindful of this, right? That whoever your user is at this point in time, it's incredibly likely it won't represent who your user will become, right? So that's something very important to keep in mind. And for us at Moonfare, what that meant was basically people in our network, people we knew from the industry, professional investors that were incredibly interested in the vision of Moonfare, and were willing to basically collaborate with us at this very early stage. So I'll go through right now sort of 3 things that weren't as obvious to me at the time that now that I think back were incredibly useful, or they're big learnings that I learned at this point in time. First is this one, which is focus on rhythms rather than processes. At this stage, you're 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 people. How you do things really doesn't matter that much, right? Because you're very small, and you'll probably end up doing things in very different ways all the time. You'll have to wear a lot of hats, so it'll be incredibly fluid. So really, the process of how you do things really doesn't matter that much. Yeah. What's incredibly important is the rhythm, and what I mean by rhythm is, the definition of rhythm is a strong, regular, repeated pattern of movement or sound. So if you see here on the right, this is actually the board that we used as a company at the time. It was actually a real wall with real stickies. And as you can see, there's not a lot of science behind it. But what was most important about this, that really got us off, and really got us executing on and actually conceptualizing and building the product and making things fall into place, was that we had this rhythm where every week, each and every one of us would basically take stickies from the backlog, the ones that we thought were the most important, put them in selected, and almost kind of like commit to having them done by the end of the week, right? And not a lot of process in between, right? Not a lot of stuff that happened or process, but that rhythm of every week sort of starting, selecting, and getting those two done, that was incredibly important at that stage. Next one is maybe a somewhat unpopular one, especially at later stages, but do it manually, right? I think you'll try to resist this, or certain people will try to resist this, obviously, because doing things manually can also be painful and add overhead to you or your teammates. But doing things manually at this time is really going to help you become a domain expert. It's really going to help you understand how the status quo, what users feel like with your competitors at the moment. Yeah, what users go through. And doing things manually will allow you to do that, right? It won't always be the most popular opinion, but I do think it was very helpful that we did this. For us, what that meant is the first fundraise for the first fund that we launched. We basically did it, most of it, right? Kind of like the old school way, which is pen and paper, phone calls, emails, still obviously in a very professional way, but not necessarily in a very digital way. And then last one for this stage, for the innovator stage, is a very bittersweet one. You will have an incredible concept and your team is going to come up with a fantastic MVP. Be ready to kill your darlings, because whatever that MVP is, you're going to have to cut it in half, if not more. And that's going to be emotionally very painful. But whatever you do, the most important thing at this stage really is to launch. Because once you launch and once you have something out there, it becomes a lot easier to iterate and to build upon things, right? If you never really launch, you never get there. You kind of get stuck in that last mile, right? So we, for example, actually, before I go to the next slide, we had this nice MVP with 5 different modules, basically for you to be able to transact and invest in a fund and do reporting. We ended up with 2 of those, 2 out of 5, 2 very basic ones, basically a registration for you to create an account or to, to give us some information, and then an indication of interest, right? Which was not very sophisticated. It was almost like a tile and a click, basically. So moving on to the next stage, which is the early adopters. And the way you get to this stage is you've launched, you feel good because things kind of start to work. You've made some sales, and now you're basically at a good functioning product, right? Because you've built the rest of the modules, so you can digitally transact now. It's still small and bare bones, right? Don't get me wrong, but it works, right? It works from start to finish. There's something to show. There's something you're kind of proud of. At this stage, the small efforts you do, at least at the beginning of the stage, the small efforts you do to get the word out there around your product feel huge, right? In retrospect, they're not that big, but you're still small, right? You're still a team of 10, 15, 20 people, at least at the start of the stage. But an initial crowd starts to gather at your door, right? Because people like what you're selling, yeah. Even if you're not as good at it in explaining your product yet or your value proposition. So because you're coming off from this great high and things are working and people like what you're doing and there's a crowd kind of forming around your door, obviously a very over dramatized image, but this is kind of like what you expect to feel at this stage, feeling really good, things are working. What it really looks like is slightly more professional version of that. Things feel good. It's a bit less dramatic, obviously, than the previous photo, but at this point, your team is bigger, small enough to feel like a small family, right? Which is great. Communication easily flows between team members. You're still 15, 20 people, right? So it's easy to communicate. Everyone knows each other. Maybe you're in the news, like you see here. Things start to work and people start to notice you. And because of this, who are your users at this stage? Well, it's almost like if you're a rock band, right? They're your diehard fans. They really love you. They're frontline screaming and taking photos of you, and And what's really important about this, and in a very real way, is that because that's the case, because your early adopters genuinely, really to the core, believe in your value prop and what you're providing and the problem you're solving, they'll see through a lot of your shortcomings, right? And I think that's a very important thing to recognize at this stage, that your early adopters, for the most part, will forgive you for having, a few bugs in the front end or in their journey, right? For maybe something being misspelled, obviously as a mistake. Some things being done manually, or some things being slightly annoying in your application, right? They'll forgive you and they'll see past that, right? So that's very important to recognize in your user at this point in time. However, these are your users that believe in your vision and what your product can become. So they're very collaborative. And they are the ones that will help you basically build a really, really great experience in your product. So it's a very special user. And if you get to this stage successfully, it really means that you're solving a real problem in people's lives. Yeah. Sometimes also referred as product market fit, but that's not territory I want to touch today. So a few things that weren't as obvious to me at the time that are now good learnings to have is at this stage, it was incredibly important, and it really paid off for us to get the core planning and development process right. Now, at the time, you will want to overlook this most likely, because things are working, your users like you, you're excited about the product, you're getting feedback all the time, and this almost feels like too corporate, or it almost feels like you're focusing too much on process too early. Right, so it won't necessarily be a very popular opinion to focus on this, but it really did pay off for us later on to get this right at the time. Now, what I do not mean by this is that you choose Scrum, Kanban, whatever you want, right? You should choose whatever works for you and your organization and your engineering counterparts. That's not what I mean, right? Choose whatever works for you. What I mean is to implement something and then refine it and get the details right. Because for us, what it meant really, it was small details that really paid off over time. Things like implementing the Scrum process and then start to automate a few things around, right? Then start to really refine and over time find the best solution for things like, okay, what are we going to check during code review, right? What are the things this person's going to do or that person's going to do when things pass on to a QA, right? Like, what are the things he or she is going to check? And automating a lot of that process, right, in small sort of like details, became really helpful once we decided to be 2 teams, 3 teams, 4 teams, right? And it really started to create the planning and development culture we have now. I credit a lot of this or most of this to our engineering leadership, which at this point in time put a lot of time and effort and dedication into this. And it's something I see really paid off for all of us. The next slide the next teaching is pay back your technical debt, which is at every stage controversial, sometimes unpopular, popular with others. But this is a really good time to pay back your technical debt. Be aware though that you won't want to pay it back because you don't have to. You don't have enough that you're forced to. And actually one of the product managers in our team, Nick, he explained it to us, or at least it was a really good way he put it that I always remember, which is technical debt is just like real debt. It's like taking out a loan. You'll have to pay it back at some point, otherwise you run into trouble, right? And what it means at this stage is that you don't have the debt collector in your door trying to seize your car and your assets. That's not the case. So it's a really good time to pay it back, especially because you also have to remember that if you pay it back now, you'll be able to use that debt later. So it's a really good time to pay that back while it's still not as complex, while it's still not as intense, and the repercussions of it aren't as harsh. So at this point in time, what we did is we took certain parts of the code, refactored them. We turned some of the parts of the code into microservices, right, which paid off later on. One thing I've learned as well around technical debt is it really helps to treat technical debt as any feature, right? To put a scope to it, assign a value to it, and basically treat it as a feature that you also prioritize in your normal prioritization process. And that's always, that's been a big learning for me in the last 4 years as well. And also working with the engineering team to always keep an up-to-date technical debt roadmap as well. In this stage also, it was very important, or one thing that really paid off was putting yourself, or putting ourselves at the time, in the front line. What I mean by this is the real front line. So actually the product team, which was 2 of us at the time, we added ourselves to the email inbox for all inbound messaging, right? So for everything going to sales and customer success, which wasn't always a popular decision, right? Because arguably it's a lot of noise that you get, yeah, and a lot of emails and messages, and you can quickly get involved in a lot and sort of lose track of things. However, at least for us and Moonfare, it wasn't enough volume so that it would become a real problem, right? Obviously, it was a lot of noise, but it didn't really become a problem. And what it helps you do, positioning yourself here, is it lets you have incredible visibility into what users are actually saying. Because sure, you have some data and analytics and you see where people drop off. But here, if you put yourself in the front line, you're really getting the nitty-gritty of the things that are confusing, the things that people maybe complain about, the things that people find great, right? And you're able to be proactive and sort of do these ad hoc things where you see a message come in and you know that the salesperson is going to call this person to problem solve, and you can maybe even participate in that call, right? And then it really speeds you up in terms of the iterations you do to your product to increase the quality, right? Because getting those details right really increase the quality of your product, right? I included here some of the NPS comments we got at the time from real users. And last one on this stage is really enjoy it. This is a super cool stage to be in as a company, mostly because it's very creative. Things are working, you're building a lot, and it's a very collaborative spot. Not that you won't bump into this later on, because you will, especially as you split into different product teams and stuff. Every time you launch a product feature, you probably go through this as well, or a big feature, a big product. But at a company level, I think this is a very, very cool time. And if you ever find yourself in it, make sure you enjoy it. So the next stage is the chasm, which is basically what's in between your early adopter and early majority user base. And the way you come into this stage is, you're almost like on a high, right? Because things work, your users love you, you get great NPS comments, people buy, people repeat, buy again, people refer, and things are looking really good. So it almost feels like your expectation coming into this is almost like, okay, we IPO next week, right? Things are fantastic. This is going to work for sure. And that's kind of how you get to this stage. The reality of this stage is that this stage starts to look a little bit like this. Mostly because to that point, you've almost followed a linear path, right? Or a very directional path, right? And still things stop to feel that way. And it starts to feel more as a map, right? It starts to feel more as a map where you have certain places you can go, different paths you can take, different mountains you can conquer, things like this. So it almost becomes, way more noisy, right? It also becomes much more complex. One way to recognize that you're in this phase is that things that used to work yesterday obviously aren't working as well anymore, right? And what I mean by that is things like, for example, acquisition tactics or growth tactics, right? You start to see differences in your acquisition channels, which you can attribute to anything. You start to see things that you were doing in terms of activation. And also, right, you kind of have a hard time explaining why things changed, because you really didn't change anything or anything fundamental. In this phase, it'll be incredibly important that you do a few things, which we'll go through in a bit, or at least in my opinion, it was incredibly important that we did. First off, and this one might seem obvious, and if you've done this before this stage, good for you, because it never hurts to do it before. But this is where you really need to establish your product process. And I don't mean define it, and I don't mean explain it. I mean really establish it at a company level, right? With the executive level, with your stakeholders, with commercial, engineering, design, right? So all around as a company, really establish a process that you follow, right? It doesn't have to be incredibly complex. In fact, I personally think it helps if you lower the resolution, right? For example, you see our high level process here. Very simple. It'll make it easier for people who aren't as close to product to understand it and to participate in it. So once you realize that you're going to be a much bigger and participate in a more complex user base, you will want to start to do more things. You will want to start to address this user and that user. Maybe you'll internationalize, and you will have to start to serve different needs and solve different problems for users. So one thing you really have to do is you need to go from the pirate ship mentality that you have in a company of 20, 30, 40 people and move more towards being like the Navy, right? And I don't mean like the full-on Navy, right? But somewhat like the Navy, right? Where there's processes, there's responsibilities, certain people make certain decisions, and most importantly, you as a company all respect them, right? And agree to abide by them. Second on this stage is set a product culture and write it down. I think this might sometimes be perceived at this stage as a nice to have, right? Or maybe sometimes even just kind of like a feel good type of activity. I'll disagree with that. Given a strong culture and setting a strong culture at this time will get you a few things, right? One, it will allow you to set the stage for you to give guidance on decision making, right? Because if you share the same set of values, and the same the values should be what drive your culture. If you share the same set of values, it'll be a guide for decision making at all levels, right? A strong culture will also create trust amongst you and product, and will be able to communicate how you guys work and how your team works outside of product. And most importantly, at this stage is when your product team starts to become big and where you start to hire. So it will help you hire people with a similar mindset if you're able to articulate it and you've written it down. So write it down, revisit it quarterly, do a retrospective, and build it over time with you and your team. And last one for this stage, which is very different than the two before, but arguably one of my favorites, is at this point in time and at this stage in the company, when you're going from 40 to 80, maybe even 100 people, you'll start to hire a lot of different senior stakeholders in commercial, for example, or in finance or in operations or whatever it is, right? Maybe people that aren't as familiar working with in a tech company or with tech teams. So infrastructure bets will become harder to sell, quote unquote, right? Because obviously it's a lot easier for people to relate to a nice, cute little user flow with nice buttons and nice screens and emotions here and there. And all of a sudden, these infrastructure bets start to become harder to communicate and harder to sort of like rally around. Be mindful that these can be and have been for us some of the most important bets that, in my opinion, have probably paid off the most. I'd love to share more details. Unfortunately, these I cannot, obviously because they're competitive advantages. But they've basically been the ones, those two bets that we've made. One of them was responsible for allowing us to internationalize so fast and become a global company so fast. And the second one was responsible for allowing us to build and support a B2B channel as well. So moving on to the last stage, hopefully I haven't lost many of you, is the early majority. And the main difference between this stage and the previous one is that your user dramatically changes, because you go from this rockstar fan user to a much more skeptical user. So now it's not even a user. Now it becomes a little bit of an ecosystem, right? Not only because your external user becomes different types of personas and with different problems and different demographics and different types of backgrounds and different understandings of your value proposition, you also have an ecosystem of internal users that you also have to work with, maintain, and basically tools and technology for. And this is really when your product starts to enter a larger market, more than what you have experienced before. Yeah, and it's very important to recognize that. Now, users that come at this stage, they usually want to see well-established references before they buy whatever you're selling. And very important to recognize and contrast from your early user is that they're more skeptical about you and will forgive you for much less, which means that bug you had with your early adopter that went overlooked probably won't go overlooked in this stage. Yeah, and this type of user won't really forgive that. And I think that's very important to note. Let's talk a bit about what this phase starts to look like. Things start to be different in the sense that, or I guess first and foremost, you move or should move away from this type of thinking that you had at the beginning, right? In the innovators and some of the early adopters phase of the MVP, right? Where you kind of like release a stripped bare bones type of feature. And you start to release things that, or should be starting to release things that are well validated in discovery. Yeah, things that you're already very confident about. You should release things where you're willing to bet and really put resources behind, right? And then you should be confident about these bets. Remember, your user or the user you're trying to solve problems for now is a lot more skeptical about you. So this is really also the phase where you really start to lead. The industry starts to really talk about you. You also have start to collaborate amongst your industry and your space. And now people really are talking about you and collaborating with you. I've included two different things that we've done in the last year. On top, we basically launched a secondary market in collaboration with Lexington Partners, which is a very, very well recognized player in our state, in our industry, right, in the space that we're in, to release the first of its kind, a secondary market that has participation from an institutional backer, right, which is one of a kind in the industry today, or at least in our space. And also below, we also have a different type of product, which is basically a portfolio of different funds that we offer with a lower minimum, right? So that you can invest in the top managers investing in US tech companies. Yeah, and the place where these both came from, I think it's important to note, is because our user starts to change, also the value proposition of the things that we offer and the problems we solve have to adapt to those users, right? So using the example at the bottom, we started to find that there were users that wanted just a lower barrier to entry, right? Or wanted to focus only on tech funds. Yeah, and we created a product for them. It was very successful, or is very successful. So a few things to note on this stage that I really think for you to be successful, you need to get right. First off is get the organization right and how you basically organize your teams. And what I mean by this is at this point, you're 100, 150 people, and you probably hired many senior stakeholders, leaders from all parts of the company, right? And your company starts to become somewhat more complex. And the risk you run once you hit that 100, 150 mark is that if you're not organized correctly, you might be using the same resources to run in different directions, right? So cross-functionally, your teams need to share same or very similar KPIs so that you're all rowing in the same direction. So it's very important to get the organization right, yeah, and who's assigned to whom. We yourselves have opted for a simplified version of the Spotify model, which is popular and unpopular at the same time, depends on who you are. But we've adopted for something along those lines. We've taken that model and made it our own. So we basically use teams, which Spotify would call squads, as well as groups, which Spotify would call tribes, to organize ourselves. We've been very specific around, who's the stakeholder, what's that interaction, which decision falls under where. And this has really helped us in planning and executing, in avoiding friction amongst teams. which I think you need to do, because at this stage of the company, what you really need to focus on is having many winners and many champions in your company. And I don't mean individuals, I mean teams, right? Because you have to win a lot in many different battles, right? So you need to make sure that you organize your organization right, so that can happen. Another thing that I think has been incredibly helpful for us at this point in time, and that I would advise you to do, maybe you could even do it earlier, right, is to put a lot of detail into documenting each team's portfolio. And what I mean by that, as you start to go from 2 teams to now maybe 9 Scrum teams, your product gets big. And really all the things you've built in the last 4 years, now is a portfolio of things, of features you've built and now you have to maintain. And what you end up doing a lot as product management is you're taking sort of things that you want to do and problems you want to solve for users, and you also have to match that with what's in the legacy code, right? With what you've already built, because you also have to understand effort, right? And if you're going to do that second part, it is really incredibly helpful for you to be able to quickly understand and rely on documentation, yeah, so that you can accelerate discovery, especially in terms of effort. It also sets the tone for these teams to eventually become their own business units, right? With business KPIs, maybe even P&L at one point. And last but not least, it's probably the one we put most focus on in the last year, is to make sure that you decentralize decision making. Because as I said in the 2 slides before, what's most important is that you have many teams that are successful, not just one, right? And for that to be the case, you need to start to hand decisions and decentralize them. And what helps here is if you're very specific about that, right? And if you set the rhythms right with the right meetings, and you're specific about the decisions that need to be taken and who takes those decisions. And it's also important to be specific about who needs to get feedback, regardless of the decision. That's, I think, incredibly important for you to continue to make yourself down the curve, and eventually IPO and do fun stuff like this. So that's the end of the presentation. There's a recap there, obviously going through the stages. As I said, it's not an exhaustive list. I picked the ones that I thought were maybe less obvious, or at least less obvious to me at the time, as I reflected back on the last 4 years. I guess I'll end on one last note, which is we're hiring, obviously, right? You see which stage we're in as a company. Would love for anyone who's interested to take a look at the open positions we have. You'll find a few product design and engineering roles, some commercial roles, of course. We'll be opening more roles in the coming months, right? So they're not online yet, or all of them not online. Reach out to me or Lewis. Lewis is also going to be part of the networking section afterwards. And Lewis is our talent acquisition manager at Moonfare. In case you're interested in any of the roles or learning more about Moonfare, would love to have that conversation.
Thank you so much, Gerardo, for the insightful presentation. It was really nice to see you touched some of the topics like scoping the tech debt and also the tips around becoming the early adapters yourself. So thanks a lot for that. So everyone, you're now welcome to ask questions, either verbally or in chat in the Zoom. And those of you who are joining from YouTube or Facebook, we'll transfer your questions here. So yeah, by the time we get the questions, I have one question for you, Gerardo. So you mentioned that the early adapters are mostly friends or families or your own community. So how do you proceed with feedback from those people? Because as you mentioned that they may not be your future users. So how do you proceed with the product development at that point of time?
So good question. I think maybe you're referring to even an earlier stage, which is the innovators. I think the first one where there's your friends, family, neighbors, and stuff. Look, I don't mean that you should ignore them, right? Because they're not going to be your core users. but it's almost like take it with a grain of salt, right? Or really recognize that at that point, right? That maybe big decisions around like, how do we communicate a value proposition, that user base might not be the best to trust to establish that long term, right? Because they might give you an answer that's not going to be representative for your later users. Having said that, though, I think those are the right users for you to start to tweak and basically keep on building on the MVP you have devised that you didn't get to build, right? And the most important thing is to basically practice whatever product does best, right? Which is, release something, get feedback, understand the iterations, understand what will drive business KPIs, match that, and then come up with a second iteration, and a third and a fourth.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for answering this. So I see raised hand from Anshu. Anshu, if you'd like, you can unmute and ask the question directly.
Hey, hi, thank you. So my question is, you mentioned you should write your culture, and that's not clear to me. How do you write culture? Like culture is like taking ownership or being less bureaucratic or being fun. And these are the things, even if you, let's say, hypothetically create a Confluence page, write up all these things, what you do with that? How does this formalizing culture works? Like, how do you document it?
Good question. I think, or at least I'll tell you what we did. We wrote, and we went in a very product way. We did like a prioritization workshop with stickies and blah, 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 blah. It was very, it was a bunch of product people in the room. So it became a very product, it looked like a product workshop. But what we ended up with was basically 4 values that are written down that maybe if you see them, they might not seem like they mean a lot, but I'll use one example, right? So one of our values reads something along the lines of, we know and acknowledge that our users expect the very best. And the reason why we wrote this at the time, or the thinking of why we wrote this, was because the conversation revolved around, well, the space that we, Moonfare, operates in, it's with a lot of very successful professionals, CEOs, managing directors, entrepreneurs, executives in Europe, right, that want to invest their money in private equity funds. These people are sophisticated and they're really used to white glove service, right? So it's not only that we're competing with an offline competitor that is not digital and maybe painful, they're also really good at service. They'll call you and remember the name of your children, and they'll remember your last conversation. They'll take you out to dinner, right? So that's how that value ended up there. That it's almost like a recognition that that's kind of like the level and the bar that our offline competitor is at, that we need to reach all the time with anything that we release, anything that we put on a screen, and how we communicate to users as well, right? Because it also has to translate down to things like, how does customer success communicate to clients, or sales communicate to clients, right? What does those fund launching emails sound like and feel like and look like? So I don't know if that answers your question, right? But essentially, it looks very simple, right? It's just a set of 4 values, right? Four sentences with a bit of an explanation below, and we refined those over time. So it's not like we set them and they were all magically there. We kind of evolved them, and every quarter we talked about, maybe this isn't clear, or maybe we need to adjust this or that.
Yeah, it absolutely does answer my questions, and it's a very interesting take that the culture emerges from the values you have. So that's a good thought. Thanks for answering.
No problem.
Thank you so much for the question, Anshu. So we have some questions on the Zoom chat. Does anyone of you want to ask them verbally, or we can take them up?
So do you want? I'm happy to pick them, right? So, the first one is a comment. So the second one's a question. How do you scope the technical debt? Is it just a case of saying when the activity is done? Or do you go more down a performance route, such as it must be 20% quicker, or the test suite must run in under 2 minutes? Well, unfortunately, the answer I have for this is it depends, right? Because as any feature, it really depends, right? Let me give you one example of something we did. we at some point, got this feedback from obviously around the organization, right? I won't put fingers, but oh, the platform's too slow, or oh, there's broken pages, or oh, there's this and that. We need to pay tech debt. And the discovery you do there is you really have to understand what's driving that tech debt, which for us at the time meant there were something like 15, 20 endpoints. They were way slower than all the other endpoints, right? So the example I'm giving you is somewhat simple, I think, or at least as I say it, it's simple. I think in retrospect or at the time, it didn't feel as simple, right? Because you have to basically search through some technical data, maybe rely on engineering, also to give you a bit of a hint of where to look. But that's kind of what we did, right? We chose the 15 endpoints, and we have a certain benchmark where we say, well, if an endpoint, is slower than this, right? It's something that we want to fix, right? And that's kind of how we scoped it and put a scope around it and address that issue. So hopefully that answers your question, Ian. Mihai asked, I saw that a number of Scrum Masters are always the same as the number of PMs. Can you talk a bit about on how your team is structured? Well, I'll tell you how our team is structured now, but I'll also tell you kind of how we think about this. So we have, I think, 7 teams, at least fully executing at the moment, right? We're not sort of like in building phase. And we have 2 or 3 Scrum Masters, right? Now, I think, and personally myself as a PM, I think every PM should have the choice to do that, to say, well, for me to be most effective, I need to use, or I want to use or rely on a Scrum Master for this or that, right? There's certain PMs that really don't require or want a Scrum Master. Me, myself, personally, I didn't rely on one, right? It was something I decided to do myself or pair with my tech lead to do that back when I was managing a team. So it really depends, right, on your style. And I think every team and group should have their own style and be able to operate as they wish, right? Obviously, there's a conversation around resources, but if that makes a team effective and that makes a product manager win, right, then that's definitely on the table for us, right? So you can adjust to your own style. Okay, so Mirella, what's your favorite question for PM candidates? I don't know if that's a trick question, but no, I don't think anything too crazy. I think I always ask, what is a product you really love? And what are some decisions you think that product team has taken for you to love it, not like it, but love it, right? Because I think, anyways, I do think there's a lot of interesting conversations you can have with this question. Next question here is, how do you decide when to automate or continue with a manual process? Consider some of the competing factors you highlighted, such as domain knowledge, cost, time to market, and so on. This is a very hard question because, again, it's very situational, right? There's certain things that, for example, we've talked about automating since the beginning that maybe we haven't gotten to fully automating them. And look, the truth here is, or at least the way I think of it, is that when you decide on roadmap priorities and what to address and what not to address, or what to automate or build or have this prioritization conversation, it shouldn't end there. You should really keep the door open and set a rhythm. I think that's been very important for us, that we've set a rhythm with the organization of how we address and sort of rethink or talk about roadmap priorities. So everyone knows that every month, even stakeholders and commercial executive members as well, that every month we revisit the priorities and the roadmaps, right? In a very open and transparent conversation, right? Because you almost have to make and rally behind that decision in that sort of like constant rhythm. And the truth is, there's too many cases for me to give you a straight up answer of when you should do this or when you should do that, right? I think where you should absolutely do it and no questions asked is when it's really, really hurting your users, right? Where the effect of you not automating something really gets down and creates a really bad experience for the user. But then again, what I would suggest for you is that even things like that, you respect your own process and use the same prioritization process to say, well, look, this is important now, we're not going to do this other thing, or this is going to wait. Hopefully that's a good enough and not vague explanation. So next question is, at what point of time during scaling do you start changing the messaging around your core value proposition? This is an inherent risk of alienating your early adopters. Very, very good point. Also very complex, or a hard thing to answer with a simple answer, right? Because it's tricky for any business, right, or for any product. It's kind of like, for example, a car all of a sudden launching the economic, or a luxury car launching the economic version of the car, right? You really risk alienating some of your top users that thought of you as the biggest luxury brand ever, right? So I think for you to do this successfully, you really need to rely on different types of experts, and this is where you really start to work closely with marketing as well, right? Because they also have to give you the sort of the insight and knowledge as experts into how to do this, how to position this. It's obviously always good to test and experiment and have these conversations. But if you treat and respect your process around discovery and include this as part of your discovery, I think your chances of failing at that are going to decrease.
Thank you so much, Gerardo, for answering all the questions. We have some questions from LinkedIn, so I'll just
Sure.
ask them here now. So Gustav asks, what did you do to overcome the awkward feeling you talked about that was present in the team at the beginning?
What you do anyways when you meet, a new team. But actually, let me maybe be more specific. I think the normal things you would do, right? Like, I don't know, going to have a beer or two after work on Thursday or Friday, go to lunch together, right? So nothing out of the ordinary, I think. But maybe I'll be specific in one or two things that I think are particular about that stage and that question, right? One is, once you really start to get into it and things start to speed up and you can start to get closer to your MVP, you'll start to work a lot. And what I mean by that is you'll start to jump around a lot, many different things. And even as a product manager, maybe you'll get involved in legal or sales. So you start to collaborate a lot with that small group. And that will almost kind of like accelerate you getting out of that awkwardness and sort of building very strong relationship with them, right? So what I found at least was that sort of like bond happened very fast, right? It didn't happen sort of like gradually. It happened incredibly fast all of a sudden. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is, one thing we did, I talked about values and culture, was set values and culture for the company at the time, right? And I think that added a lot of trust within that smaller circle, especially given one of our values was transparency, right? And by really living that value and being transparent around the things that we were doing, from the founders to the team, I think that also was one crucial thing that accelerated that bond, that initial bond with the team.
Thank you so much for the tips there, Gerardo. So we have a few more questions from LinkedIn. So how do you prioritize technical depth when stakeholders might want new features?
Good question. But this is kind of the skill that you need to master as a product manager, right? Because one thing you really have to do is, again, you have to treat it as a feature, right? You really have to understand the underlying, to a good extent, right? To a zoomed in extent, and obviously rely on an expert and engineer to do that. But to a good extent, what is that going to drive for you or your organization, or what it's going to risk if you don't do it, right? And if you're able to vocalize that and communicate that, so that you're a translator between those two functions and are able to sit, in some sort of council, or we call those councils, right? The prioritization meetings, and provide a transparent conversation around doing this versus that. I think that's where you start to become a really good PM, right? Because you have to earn the trust of not only the executive team, but also of your engineering team and your design team, and that's very important for you, right? So especially as the company starts to get bigger, I think you need to become this sort of like trusted broker of decisions, right? And lead the group from the executive team to anyone else, right? To fulfill the company's vision, and to also make sure that the way there is not as rocky.
Great. Thank you so much, Gerardo. So being mindful of the time, I'll just take up last question from LinkedIn. So this is from Richard. He's asking, how do you keep engaging with your early adopters after the early majority takes place? Do you merge the strategies right away, or do you work with them separately for a while to get different feedbacks?
Look, I'll give you my experience. Funny enough, is like we really haven't done much or nothing too conscious around that exactly. But my experience is that the early adopters, if you do things right, will stick around and will always be coming back, because you're almost like, if you talk to them enough and sort of like build those relationships initially, you almost build a relationship with them. For example, one thing we do, or at least some of us do here in Moonfare, is the early adopters. They're always really good users, sort of like for quick feedback. If you're working on a new feature and maybe have a prototype or even a design or something, to just kind of say like, hey, do you have 15 minutes for me to show you something? Right? Or hey, do you have 15 minutes over the phone? Let me explain, or let me ask you a few questions. And they'll always be open, right? I think it's. Or maybe now that I'm saying it, I think one thing we've consciously done is to keep those relationships, right, and maintain them and check in with them, because they're also a really good source for you, especially later on, to get quick client feedback and have someone sort of like a phone call away.
Okay, great. Thank you for answering this. I hope this answered the question. Yeah, I think we are on time now, so we'll stop streaming and continue the networking on Zoom. So people who are joined on YouTube and Facebook can join us on Zoom. We can have a couple of minutes for networking as we are already on time. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining and engaging with the presentation and asking very interesting questions. And thank you, Gerardo, for the presentation and answering all these questions in detail.
Great, thank you for having me.